The county inspector had expected to shut down a junkyard. Instead, she stepped into an old red barn and forgot why she had come. For nearly 10 seconds, nobody spoke. Not the inspector, not the operations manager from Blue Ridge Timber, not the neighbors who had spent the last 2 years complaining about the growing piles of discarded lumber behind the Carter farmhouse. Not even Walter Collins, the loudest voice in town, and the man who had once joked that Emily Carter was raising termites instead of crops. They all stood frozen beneath the weathered barn rafters, staring at something that should not have existed. Morning sunlight slipped through narrow cracks in the old wooden walls, sending thin beams of light drifting across thousands of floating specks of sawdust. As the dust moved through the air, it looked almost like golden snow. And at the center of the barn stood a tree, not a living tree, a wooden one. Its roots spread across the floor like giant hands gripping the earth. Its trunk twisted upward nearly 15 feet before exploding into hundreds of branches that reached toward the rafters. Every limb carried hand-carved leaves so delicate they seemed ready to flutter with the slightest breeze. Owls watched from dark hollows. A fox slept beneath tangled roots. 2 cardinals rested side by side near the highest branch. Nothing inside that barn had grown naturally. Every inch had been carved by hand, from wood everyone else had thrown away. Walter Collins slowly removed his hat. For the first time in anyone's memory, he had nothing to say. 3 years earlier, another truck rattled down Riverbend Road. The old diesel engine coughed loudly as it pulled into the Carter property just after sunrise. Emily heard it before she saw it. She was already outside. Her work gloves hung from the back pocket of her faded jeans. A thermos of coffee rested on the porch railing beside a notebook filled with rough sketches and measurements. Frank Carter opened the front door carrying 2 mugs. "You've been waiting?" Emily glanced toward the road. "It usually gets here around 7. Frank handed her a mug. "You remembered? You always forget breakfast when the truck comes." Emily smiled. "Coffee counts." "No," Frank laughed softly. "Coffee survives breakfast. It doesn't replace it." The truck backed toward the rear fence. Its hydraulic bed rose with a metallic groan. Seconds later, a mountain of discarded hardwood crashed onto the ground. Twisted oak, cracked maple, warped cherry, knotted walnut, crooked cedar limbs, pieces too damaged for furniture, too irregular for flooring, too expensive for the company to process. To Blue Ridge Timber, they were waste. To Emily, they were possibilities. The driver climbed down from the cab. "Morning, Frank." "Mornin', Dale." Dale wiped his hands on his jeans before looking toward Emily. "Got a strange batch today." Emily was already walking toward the pile. "What kind?" He pointed near the bottom. "Storm-damaged white oak." She crouched immediately. Her fingers brushed across rough bark, still carrying bits of moss. Then she found it. A massive, twisted root, nearly hidden beneath the rest of the load. Most people would have seen firewood. Emily saw movement. She smiled without realizing it. Frank noticed. "There it is." Dale looked confused. "What?" "That look." Frank nodded toward his daughter. "Every time she finds something special." Emily wrapped both arms around the root and tried to lift it. It barely moved. Dale laughed. "Easy there." He climbed back onto the truck, grabbed a chain, and helped drag the root onto the grass. When it finally settled onto the ground, Emily knelt beside it as though greeting an old friend. She traced one of the twisted roots with her fingertips. The grain curved naturally around an old knot. The wood looked almost alive. "You see something?" Frank asked. Emily nodded. "I just don't know what yet." Walter Collins had been watching everything from across the road. Like every morning, he leaned against his spotless white fence with a coffee cup in one hand and a newspaper tucked beneath his arm. His lawn looked perfect. His hedges were trimmed with military precision. Not a single weed dared grow in Walter Collins' yard. He frowned as another pile of lumber hit the Carter property. Then he raised his voice, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Frank. Frank sighed quietly. Here we go. Walter pointed toward the growing piles. Planning to open the county landfill? Dale chuckled awkwardly, but kept loading his chains. Frank forced a polite smile. It's just wood. Walter snorted. It stopped being just wood, about 6 truckloads ago. Emily never looked up. Walter continued. One of these days the county's gonna make you clean that mess. Still no answer. He shook his head. I swear that girl would rescue driftwood if someone tossed it in a river. Dale climbed back into his truck. Before closing the door, he looked down at Emily. You know, she looked up. My granddad used to say something. What? Wood tells you what it wants to become. Emily smiled. He was right. Dale grinned. I figured you'd like hearing that. The truck disappeared in a cloud of dust. Walter muttered something under his breath before walking back across the road. Frank watched him leave. He really doesn't know when to quit. Emily kept studying the twisted root. He isn't looking, Frank frowned. Looking at what? She brushed away another handful of dirt. The same thing I am. And what's that? Emily finally looked up. A tree. Frank laughed. She pointed at the root. It already knows. Frank looked at the twisted piece of oak. To him, it looked exactly like what it was. A storm-damaged root nobody wanted. To Emily, it was already becoming something else. He had learned long ago not to argue with that look in her eyes, because every time she wore that expression, something remarkable usually followed. What Frank didn't know, what Walter Collins certainly didn't know, was that Emily hadn't been collecting scrap wood. Not really. She had been collecting memories. Every cracked board reminded her of someone. Every twisted branch carried a story. Every knot, scar, and split in the grain reminded her of something her mother had once said while they walked through the forests surrounding the Blue Ridge Mountains. Perfect trees don't exist, Emily. She had been only 8 years old. They were hiking after a spring rain. Emily had pointed toward a tall oak with a scar running almost the entire length of its trunk. It got hurt. Her mother smiled and placed one hand against the rough bark. It did. Will it die? Grace Carter slowly shook her head. No. She traced the scar with her fingertips. Sometimes the strongest trees are the ones that survived the biggest storms. Emily looked up into the branches where sunlight filtered through hundreds of green leaves. It still grew. Grace smiled. It never stopped. Standing beside the twisted oak root all those years later, Emily closed her eyes for just a moment. She could almost hear her mother's voice again. Then she opened them and saw not a root, not firewood, not scrap. She saw the beginning of something so extraordinary that, years later, strangers would drive hundreds of miles just to stand silently beneath its branches. By noon, the twisted oak root still had not moved more than 6 feet from where the truck had dropped it. Emily had tried pulling it with a rope, then with a garden cart, then with a rusted dolly that immediately lost one wheel. Frank watched from the porch for as long as he could stand it, before setting down his coffee and walking over. You know, he said, they're stubborn, and then there's just plain inefficient. Emily wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her glove. I'm making progress. Frank looked at the root, then at the long scrape mark across the grass. You moved it the length of a kitchen table. Progress. Emily, she sighed. I need it in the barn. No, you need help getting it in the barn. Emily looked away. Frank knew that look too. It was the look she wore whenever accepting help felt too much like failing. He softened his voice. Your mother let me help plant trees. Emily glanced at him. She said you dug crooked holes. Frank smiled. She also said I dug them with commitment. Emily almost laughed. Almost. That was enough for Frank. He walked to the shed and returned with a chain, a pry bar, and 2 old fence posts they could use as rollers. He showed Emily how to raise one side of the root, just enough to slide a post beneath it. Then another. Then, slowly, inch by inch, the two of them rolled the root across the yard. The work was awkward and heavy. The root caught on clumps of grass. The chain slipped twice. Frank pinched one finger and muttered a word Emily pretended not to hear. But by late afternoon, the root reached the barn doors. Emily stood back, breathing hard. Frank leaned against the pry bar. "There," he said. "Now it can become whatever it keeps whispering to you." Emily looked at him. "You think that's silly. I think most things sound silly, until someone proves them true." That night, Emily did not carve. She sat on the floor of the barn with the root in front of her and a notebook on her knees. The barn smelled of sawdust, old hay, machine oil, and rain that had soaked into wood decades earlier. A single bulb hung from the rafters, swinging slightly whenever wind pushed through the cracks in the walls. Emily sketched for 2 hours. Then she erased almost everything. The root was too wild to become a chair, too heavy to become a small sculpture, too alive to become firewood. Around midnight, Frank opened the barn door and held up a plate. "You forgot dinner." Emily looked surprised, as if the idea of food belonged to another world. "What time is it?" "Late enough that I should be asleep, and you should at least be pretending." He set the plate beside her. Beans, cornbread, and 2 slices of tomato. Emily picked up the fork. Frank looked at the sketches scattered around her. "Anything yet?" She shook her head. "It's too big." That's usually what people say right before doing something interesting. She took a bite of cornbread. After a long pause, she said, "What if I can't do it?" Frank sat on an overturned crate. "Do what?" "What I see." He studied her face carefully. For a moment, he did not see the 17-year-old girl with sawdust on her sleeves. He saw the 11-year-old child sitting silent in a church pew, holding a folded program from Grace's funeral so tightly the paper bent in her hands. Frank had tried to speak to her after that day, many times, but grief had built a wall between them, and neither of them had known which side held the door. So he answered the only way he knew, "Then start with what you can do." Emily looked at the root. "That's not enough. It is if you keep starting." She did not respond. Frank stood. "Eat, then sleep." At the door, he paused. "And she looked back. "Big things don't get built by people who feel ready. They get built by people who keep showing up." After he left, Emily sat alone with the root. She did not know then that those words would carry her through the next 3 years. The first month, she did not touch the root with a blade. That made Frank nervous. It made Walter Collins suspicious. And it made several kids at school more creative with their jokes. One boy named Travis leaned against Emily's locker one morning and said, "My dad says your backyard's visible from space now." His friend laughed. Emily opened her locker. Travis continued, "You building a wooden spaceship?" She took out her math book. "Need help with yours?" His smile disappeared. "What?" "Your project. In shop class." She closed the locker. "You glued the shelf upside down." His friend burst out laughing. Travis turned red. Emily walked away before he could recover. She did not always stay silent. She simply chose her moments. But choosing moments did not mean the words never hurt. That afternoon she came home angry. She threw her backpack onto the porch, walked into the barn, picked up one of her early carvings, and snapped it in half with both hands. Frank heard the crack from the kitchen. He found her standing by the workbench, breathing fast. Pieces of a half-finished rabbit lay on the floor. Frank did not ask what happened. He knew better. Instead, he picked up one half of the rabbit and turned it over. "Clean break." Emily glared at him. "That's all you have to say?" "No." He picked up the other half. "I was going to say it's still usable." "It is. It's ruined." Frank looked at her. "Emily, ruined is when there's nothing left to learn." Her eyes filled, but she refused to cry. "I'm tired of people laughing." Frank set the broken pieces on the bench. I know. No, you don't. He waited. She looked away. They think I'm crazy. Are you? No. Then they're wrong. That doesn't make it easier. No, Frank said. It doesn't. That honesty stopped her more than any comfort would have. Frank leaned one hip against the bench. When your mother first planted her garden, Walter Collins told her half those roses wouldn't survive the clay soil. Emily frowned. He did? More than once. What did Mom say? Frank smiled faintly. She asked him if he wanted to be right or helpful. Emily almost smiled. And? He brought compost the next week. She looked toward the root. He's different now. People get different when they lose someone. Emily's expression changed. Frank realized too late what he had said. The barn became quiet. Then Emily whispered, "So did we." Frank had no answer. Neither did she. That evening, for the first time in months, Emily did not work on the wood. She and Frank sat on the porch until dark, saying almost nothing, watching the old barn fade into shadow. The next morning, she returned to the root. Not with a chisel, with a pencil. She began drawing lines directly onto the wood. Not cuts, questions. She marked where the roots already curved, where the grain pulled left, where the knots gathered like old wounds, where a crack could become a hollow. She studied every flaw until it stopped looking like damage and began looking like instruction. A week later, she made the first cut. It was small, almost invisible, but when the thin curl of oak lifted from the blade and fell onto the floor, Emily felt something in her chest loosen. The root had begun to answer. By spring, the old barn had become a place of experiments. Some worked, most did not. Emily tried carving leaves from green maple and watched them curl as they dried. She tried joining cedar to oak with cheap glue, only to find the seam open 3 days later. She tried staining walnut with store-bought finish and hated how artificial it looked. One night, she sat by the wood stove in the kitchen, staring at the ash pan. Frank looked up from a repair manual. "Why are you looking at ashes like they owe you money?" Emily reached for a spoon. "I need shadow." "You need sleep? I need both." Before he could stop her, she scooped a little ash into an old bowl and mixed it with linseed oil from the shelf. Frank stared. "That looks terrible." "It might work. It looks like something that came out of a tractor. Then you'll understand it." He laughed despite himself. She tested it on a scrap piece of oak. The ash darkened the grooves without covering the grain. It sank into the lines like age, like smoke, like weather. Emily bent closer. Frank leaned over her shoulder. "Well," he said, "I'll be." She looked up. "It looks old. It looks honest." From then on, ash became part of the tree. Not paint, not decoration, memory. By summer, Emily began collecting mirror fragments too. Not many, just small pieces, from an old cracked mirror Frank nearly threw away while cleaning the attic. He found her smoothing the sharp edges with sandpaper at the workbench. "Absolutely not," he said. She looked up. "What? Glass near a sculpture you're always reaching into? No, I'll dull the edges. No, I'll mount them high where nobody can touch them. No, I need them for light." Frank crossed his arms. Emily held a piece of mirror toward a thin beam of sun slipping through the barn wall. A small bright dot leapt across the root. Frank watched it move. Emily said quietly, "Mom used to hang little glass beads in the kitchen window." He remembered. Every morning, colored light had scattered across the floor while Grace made coffee. For a moment, the barn smelled less like sawdust and more like that kitchen. Frank sighed. "High branches only." Emily smiled. "And I wear gloves. And you wear gloves. Good gloves? Don't push it." She did not laugh often, but when she did, Frank carried the sound with him for the rest of the day. By the end of that first year, Emily still had not built the tree of life. Not visibly. There was only a root, a collection of prepared pieces, a wall full of sketches, and a father who had begun to understand that his daughter was not disappearing into grief. She was carving her way through it. But outside the barn, the piles kept growing, and Walter Collins kept watching. The second year began with rain. Not the soft mountain rain Grace used to love, the kind that made the forest smell clean and sweet. This was hard, slanting rain that came sideways across Riverbend Road and found every weak place in the old Carter barn. Emily discovered the first leak on a Tuesday night. A drop landed directly on a stack of maple leaves she had spent nearly 2 weeks cutting. Then another, then 5 more. She looked up just as water began threading through a dark seam in the roof. No, no, no. She grabbed a tarp from the corner and threw it over the workbench. Then she dragged the maple pieces away from the wall. One pile slipped from her arms and scattered across the floor. Frank heard her shout from the house and came running through the rain. By the time he reached the barn, Emily was standing on a chair with a bucket in one hand, trying to catch water dripping from 3 places at once. "This roof's gotten worse," Frank said. Emily looked down at him. "Thank you for the weather report." He almost smiled, but the worry in her face stopped him. They spent the next hour moving lumber, covering shelves, and setting buckets beneath leaks. When the worst of the storm passed, Frank climbed into the loft with a flashlight. The roof needed more than a patch. They both knew it. In the kitchen later that night, Frank spread a few bills across the table and wrote numbers on the back of an envelope. Emily sat across from him, still wearing damp socks. "How bad?" Frank did not look up. "It can wait. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have. Frank." He paused. She only called him Frank when she was angry or scared. He set the pencil down. "The roof can be patched for now. Full repair will cost more than we have this month." Emily stared at the table. "How much more?" "Enough." "That's still not an answer," he sighed. "Too much." The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain. Emily looked toward the dark window, where the barn was barely visible through the glass. "If it leaks again, the wood will warp." "I know. The leaves took 2 weeks. I know. The root could rot if water gets under it." "Emily." She stood too quickly, the chair scraping the floor. "I'll fix it myself." "Not tonight, you won't. You said we don't have money. And I said, tonight you won't." She grabbed her jacket. Frank stood. "Emily Carter, don't walk out that door." She turned back. "You can't tell me to keep building something and then tell me not to protect it." Frank's jaw tightened. "I'm telling you not to climb onto a wet barn roof in the dark." Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. He was right. That made her angrier. She looked away, blinking hard. Frank stepped closer and softened his voice. "We'll patch it tomorrow." "What if tomorrow is too late?" He looked at his daughter, soaked from the rain, furious because she loved something enough to be afraid for it. Then he said, "Then I'll sit in that barn all night with a bucket." She stared at him. "You would." Frank picked up his coat. "I've done dumber things for less important reasons." That night, father and daughter sat inside the barn with buckets under the leaks and blankets over their knees. The rain tapped, then hammered, then softened. Emily leaned against the workbench, exhausted. Frank sat beside her, holding a flashlight. After a long silence, he said, "Your mother would have liked this." Emily looked at him, sitting in a leaking barn. "No, guarding something that isn't finished yet." Emily looked toward the root in the center of the barn. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then she asked, "Did Mom ever want to leave here?" Frank seemed surprised. "Leave the house?" "The town, the road, everything." He leaned back. "Once." Emily turned to him. "When?" "Before you were born. She got accepted into some horticulture program out west." Oregon, I think. Why didn't she go? Frank smiled faintly. She met me. Emily raised an eyebrow. That better not be the whole answer. It isn't. He looked toward the barn doors. She said she could study trees anywhere, but this place already knew her name. Emily absorbed that quietly. What does that mean? I asked her the same thing. And? She said some ground remembers your footsteps. Rainwater tapped steadily into the bucket between them. Emily looked at the old root, then at the stacks of wood along the walls, then at the house beyond the barn. I think I understand. The next morning, Frank patched the roof with borrowed tin, tar, and 2 boards he insisted were temporarily permanent. Emily stood below, holding the ladder. Walter Collins watched from across the road. When Frank climbed down, Walter called out, "You know a new roof costs less than a lawsuit when that barn collapses." Frank wiped rainwater from his forehead. "Morning to you too, Walter." Walter nodded toward the stacks of wood. "That mess is getting out of hand." Emily stepped from behind the ladder. "It's organized." Walter looked at the yard. Organized junk is still junk. Frank's expression hardened, but Emily spoke first. "Your roses need pruning." Walter froze. Frank looked at her. Emily nodded toward the neglected bushes along Walter's fence. They had once bloomed so full in spring that people slowed down to admire them. Now they were tangled, brown, and half-choked with weeds. Walter's face changed. "That's none of your concern. Neither is my wood." For a second, Frank thought Walter might shout. Instead, the old man folded his newspaper under one arm and walked back into his house. Emily watched him go. Frank said quietly, "That was sharper than usual." He started it. "You're not wrong." She turned toward the barn. "But I was mean." Frank followed her gaze to the dead rose bushes across the road. "You were honest." Mom said honest can still be cruel. Frank had no answer for that. By autumn, the tree of life had begun to rise. The hidden steel frame stood bolted to the barn floor, shaped by Frank from discarded square tubing and old brackets he brought home with permission from the mill. Emily had fought the idea at first. "I want it to be wood. It will look like wood." "But it won't be." Frank tapped the sketch. "You want 15 feet of branches over people's heads someday? Someday? Don't pretend you aren't hoping people see it." Emily looked down. Frank smiled. "If someday comes, I don't want the headline to read, 'Local girl sculpture crushes Methodist choir.'" She laughed, and that settled it. The steel frame became the bones. The wood became the body. Frank welded late at night, sparks snapping in the dark barn, while Emily held a shield and pretended not to worry every time he winced from his stiff back. "You should rest," she said one night. "So should you." "I'm 17. I'm aware. You've been using it as an excuse for months." She watched him grind a rough weld smooth. "Does your back hurt?" "Only when I move." "Frank." He shut off the grinder. "Yes, it hurts." "Then stop." He looked at the steel frame, then at the root, then at his daughter. "I stopped doing too many things after your mother died." Emily did not know what to say. Frank set the grinder down. "I stopped fixing the porch light because she liked sitting under it. I stopped mowing near her garden because I couldn't stand seeing it empty. I stopped playing the radio in the kitchen because every song made the house feel too big." He looked at Emily. "I am not stopping this." The words stayed with her longer than he knew. By winter, the trunk had taken shape around the frame. It rose from the oak roots in layers of walnut shadow, maple scar, cedar peel, and cherry warmth. Emily carved deep grooves into the seams, so the joined pieces looked like bark, twisted by years of mountain weather. But the work was not smooth. One lower branch split after 3 weeks of carving because she had ignored a hairline crack. Emily threw the chisel across the barn. It struck the wall and fell into a pile of shavings. Frank looked up from a hinge he was repairing. "Feel better?" "No, didn't think so." She paced in front of the broken branch. "I knew that crack was there. Then why'd you trust it? Because I wanted it to work. Frank stood slowly. Wanting a thing to work isn't the same as listening to what it's telling you. She turned. Is this another machine lesson? Everything's a machine lesson, if you respect machines enough. Emily rolled her eyes, but he continued. When a belt slips, it tells you. When a bearing screams, it tells you. When metal heats up, it tells you. Ignore it long enough and the machine doesn't break suddenly. It breaks honestly. Emily looked at the branch. The crack ran straight through the section she had hoped would hold. It told me. Frank nodded. And you argued. She picked up the chisel. For the first time, she did not start over by pretending the broken piece had failed her. She started over by admitting she had failed to listen. That became one of the rules written in chalk above her workbench. The wood is not wrong. By spring of the second year, Riverbend Road had divided itself into two groups. People who thought Frank Carter was too soft on his strange daughter, and people who secretly wanted to know what was inside that barn. At the feed store, Walter Collins made sure the first group stayed louder. Mark my words, he told anyone who would listen. That barn is full of rot, bugs, and bad decisions. A farmer named Dale Jenkins, the same driver who delivered wood for Blue Ridge, leaned on the counter one afternoon and said, You ever actually looked inside? Walter frowned. I don't need to look inside a trash barrel to know it's trash. Dale smiled. That sounds like something a man says when he's afraid he might be wrong. The men near the coffee machine chuckled. Walter's face darkened. You hauling her the junk, so I don't expect you to see straight. Dale stopped smiling. I haul what the company throws away. What that girl sees in it is her own business. Walter left without buying the nails he had come for. That evening, he stood at his fence and stared at the Carter barn longer than usual. Inside, Emily was carving leaves, not dozens, hundreds, then thousands. She carved them from maple, cherry, and thin slices of cedar. Some were wide and simple, some curled. Some had insect bites along their edges. Some were cracked and repaired with nearly invisible seams. Frank found her asleep at the workbench one night, her cheek resting beside a pile of unfinished leaves. He gently lifted the chisel from her hand. Emily stirred. I'm awake. No, you're arguing in your sleep. She sat up slowly. How many did I finish? Enough for tonight. That's not a number. It's a father number. She rubbed her eyes. I need more. Why? The tree feels bare. Frank looked at the hundreds of leaves stacked in trays. Emily, there are forests with fewer leaves than this. She smiled tiredly. Not good forests. He shook his head, but he carried her coat from the chair and placed it around her shoulders. As the tree of life grew, Emily began hiding stories in it. A teacher reading beneath a branch, a mechanic fixing a wheel, a nurse carrying a lantern, a farmer kneeling beside a seedling, a child reaching for a leaf. None of them were random. Each one came from someone she had watched, someone who had helped, someone who had lost something, someone who kept going. And then, one afternoon, she began carving Walter Collins. Frank noticed the likeness before she finished the watering can. He stopped beside the workbench. Is that Walter? Emily kept carving. Maybe? With roses? She nodded. Frank was quiet for a moment. He won't understand. He doesn't have to. Then why include him? Emily brushed shavings from the tiny carved sleeves. Because Mom remembered him before he became angry. Frank looked toward the road. Walter's rose garden sat neglected across the way. He used to bring your mother cuttings, Frank said. Emily paused. He did? Years ago. Why didn't you tell me? I forgot. No, you didn't. Frank sighed. No, I didn't. Emily waited. Frank sat on an old crate. When Lillian got sick, Grace took food over there 3 nights a week. After Lillian passed, Walter stopped answering the door. Then Grace got sick. After that, he looked down at his hands. I guess grief made cowards of both houses. Emily did not speak for a while. Then she picked up the small carving of Walter and continued shaping the roses. Outside, the real Walter Collins stood alone in his neat, silent yard. Inside the barn, the version of him that had loved flowers began to return. By the end of the second year, the tree had reached 12 feet. The trunk was nearly complete. The lower branches carried hidden animals and small human stories. Mirror fragments waited in a labeled box. Ash-darkened grooves gave the bark depth. The repaired roof still leaked in 2 places, but only during hard rain. Emily was tired all the time. Frank was worried all the time. And Walter Collins had begun taking photographs. Not just from his yard, from the road, from the fence, from the ditch near the mailbox. One morning, Emily saw him point a camera toward the largest woodpile. She walked across the yard. "Why are you taking pictures?" Walter lowered the camera. "Evidence." "Of what?" "Neglect." Emily glanced at his yard. The rose bushes had not been pruned. Dead canes twisted through the fence. "There's a lot of that around." Walter's jaw tightened. "You think you're clever?" "No." She looked back at her barn. "I think you're lonely." For a moment, his face changed so sharply she almost apologized. Then the anger returned. "You don't know anything about me." Emily's voice softened. "I know Lillian liked roses." Walter went still. She continued. "I know Mom used to stop and talk to her. I know your garden used to be the prettiest place on this road." Walter gripped the camera tighter. "Don't talk about my wife." Emily nodded once. Then she walked away. 2 weeks later, the first complaint reached the county. Frank did not tell her immediately, but when she saw the envelope on the table, she already knew. Something was coming, and this time it might not be something she could carve her way through. The complaint letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Frank found it tucked behind the electric bill in the mailbox, sealed in a plain white envelope with the Madison County seal printed in the corner. He stood at the end of the driveway for a moment before opening it. He already knew what it was. Men like Frank learned to recognize bad news before reading it. The inspection notice was short and formal. It said the county had received multiple complaints about the condition of the Carter property. It mentioned unsafe storage of combustible material, possible pest attraction, and concerns about an unpermitted structure being used for work. The inspection date was set for April 15th. Frank read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket. He did not want Emily to see it. Not yet. When he walked into the barn that evening, she was standing on a stepladder, fastening a cluster of carved leaves to a high branch. Her hair was pinned badly on top of her head, and a pencil was stuck behind one ear. "How was work?" she asked, without looking down. "Same as always." "That means something broke. Something always breaks." "Did you fix it?" Frank looked around the barn, at the half-finished tree of life, at the trays of leaves, at the ash-stained rags, at the little carvings tucked into every branch like secrets. "Some of it." Emily glanced down. "You sound tired." "I am tired." "You want coffee?" "It's 7 at night." That wasn't the question. Frank almost smiled. She climbed down from the ladder and brushed sawdust from her sleeves. For a moment, he considered telling her about the inspection. She deserved to know. It was her project, her barn, in every way that mattered. But then he looked at the tree, and he thought of the bank letter hidden in the drawer beside the stove. That was the other thing he had not told her. The thing sitting behind his ribs like a stone. After Grace's illness, after the missed work and the medical bills and all the repairs he had postponed because there had always been something more urgent, Frank had fallen behind on the mortgage. Not far enough at first, then farther, then dangerously far. He had told himself he would catch up. One more overtime shift, one more side repair, one more small miracle. But miracles did not come with envelopes from banks. They came with deadlines. The latest letter gave him until June 1st to make the account current. If he failed, the bank could begin foreclosure. And now the county might fine him before that. Emily set a mug of coffee on the workbench. Frank looked at it. "You're trying to keep me awake. You looked like you needed help standing." He took the mug. "Fair." She returned to the tree. "You're hiding something." Frank nearly dropped the coffee. "What?" Emily did not turn around. "You do this thing with your left hand when you're worried." He looked down. His left thumb was rubbing the side of the mug. He stopped. "I'm allowed to worry." "About the roof?" "Some." "About money?" Frank said nothing. Emily turned then. The barn seemed to shrink between them. "How bad?" she asked. He forced a breath. "Not tonight, Em." "That means bad. It means I don't have the words for it yet." She studied his face. There was a time when she might have pushed harder, when fear would have sharpened her, until every sentence became a blade. But she only nodded. "Okay." Frank waited for anger. It did not come. Instead, Emily reached for a thin maple leaf and began sanding its edge. After a few strokes, she said, "When you find the words, use them." That hurt more than anger would have, because she was right. That night, after Emily went to bed, Frank sat alone at the kitchen table with both letters in front of him. County inspection, mortgage deadline, 2 pieces of paper, both threatening the same thing in different language. Loss. The house was quiet, too quiet. Frank looked toward the empty chair where Grace used to sit in the mornings with her coffee, bare feet tucked beneath her, seed catalogs spread across the table. He could still see her there if he was tired enough. "You always knew what to say," he whispered. Of course, the chair said nothing. At nearly 2 in the morning, the stairs creaked. Frank quickly folded the bank letter, but not fast enough. Emily stood halfway down the staircase in an oversized sweatshirt, her hair loose around her shoulders. "I saw it," she said. Frank closed his eyes. Foreclosure?" He did not answer. "How long?" He rubbed both hands over his face. "Months." "You hid it for months?" "I was trying to fix it." "By yourself?" "I'm your father." "That's not an answer." His voice rose before he meant it to. "It's the only answer I had." The words echoed through the kitchen. Emily flinched. Frank hated himself immediately. He lowered his voice. "I'm sorry." She came down the rest of the stairs slowly. "What happens if we lose the house?" "We're not losing the house." "What happens?" Frank looked away. She understood then. He did not know. For a while, neither of them moved. Then Emily walked to the table and picked up the county letter. She read it without speaking. April 15. Property inspection. 7 days to correct violations. Possible fines. Possible condemnation. She set it down beside the bank letter. "So it's not just the house." Frank looked up. "No. It's the barn too." He swallowed. "Maybe." Emily looked toward the dark window. The barn was nothing more than a black shape against the yard, but she knew what stood inside it. She knew every root, every branch, every hidden figure, every leaf she had carved when grief made sleeping impossible. "I can't lose it," she said. Frank's voice broke slightly. "I know." "No." She shook her head. "You don't understand," he stood. "Emily, it's not a project. I know that. It's not just art. I know. It's Mum." Frank stopped. Emily's eyes were wet now, but her voice stayed steady. "It's the only place where I still know how to talk to her." That sentence took the anger out of the room. Frank sat down slowly. For years he had thought Emily's silence meant she was drifting away from him, away from everything. But she had been speaking all along, just not in words. He looked at the letters again, then at his daughter. "I'm scared," he admitted. Emily nodded. "Me too." "I don't know how to save all of it." "Then we don't hide it anymore." Frank frowned. "What?" She looked toward the barn again. If they're coming to inspect a junkyard, we show them it isn't one. People don't always see what you want them to see. I know. Walter will be there. I know. The county might not care. I know. The bank definitely won't care. Emily stepped closer to the table. But someone might. Frank looked at her carefully. This was different. This was not the girl who whispered to Wood in a barn. This was not the child who had disappeared after Grace died. This was someone standing at the edge of losing everything and choosing to be seen anyway. "What are you saying?" he asked. Emily took a breath. "We finished the tree." Frank glanced at the calendar on the wall. "The inspection is in 3 weeks. Then we finish in 3 weeks. That's not enough time. It has to be." "It could break you." She gave him a tired smile. "Frank." He looked at her. "I think I've already been broken." He had no answer. She touched the bank letter lightly. But maybe broken things don't always stay that way. The next 3 weeks became the hardest of Emily's life. She stopped trying to make the tree perfect. That was the first change. Perfection had been slowing her down. She had spent entire evenings carving one vein into one leaf or reshaping one hidden feather no one might ever notice. Now she chose what mattered. The trunk had to be finished. The upper branches had to be secured. The hidden heart for Grace had to be placed. The mirror fragments had to be mounted high where visitors could not touch them. The carvings that told the story of the town had to be completed. Everything else could wait. Frank worked beside her every night, not just as the man who brought coffee or fixed tools. As a partner, he reinforced the branch supports, tightened bolts beneath wooden plugs, repaired the barn door hinges so they would open smoothly, moved unstable stacks outside, cut away brush near the fence. He stopped pretending this was only Emily's fight. One night, as he held a ladder steady, while she mounted a carved cardinal near the top of the tree, he looked up and said, "Your mother would be yelling at us right now." Emily smiled without looking down. "Because we're working too late? Because I'm letting you stand on the top step." "She would yell at you for that?" "She would yell at me for many things." Emily fixed the cardinal into place. "Do you miss getting yelled at?" Frank laughed softly. "Every day." She looked down. His face was turned away, but she could hear the truth in his voice. That night, after he went inside, Emily carved the small wooden heart. She made it from a piece of cherry wood Grace had saved years earlier. It had been tucked in an old drawer with seed packets, garden twine, and a note in Grace's handwriting that said, "Too pretty to burn." Emily sanded it until it fit in the palm of her hand. Then she carved one word into the center, Grace. She did not cry while carving it. She had expected to, but the tears did not come. Instead, she felt calm, as though some part of her mother had been waiting inside that little piece of cherry all along. The morning of April 15 arrived cold and clear. The sky over Madison County was pale blue, and the mountains beyond Riverbend Road looked almost purple in the distance. Emily stood in the barn before sunrise, wearing the same worn gloves she had used for years. Frank came in behind her. "You ready?" She looked up at the tree of life. "No." He nodded. "Good. Me neither." She let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. Outside, a vehicle turned onto the gravel drive. Then another. Then another. Emily closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, she said, "Let them see it." Frank walked to the barn doors. And for the first time, he did not open them to hide what was inside. He opened them to reveal it. Marion Briggs arrived at exactly 9 o'clock. She stepped out of the county vehicle with a clipboard tucked under one arm and a pair of reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She wore work boots, a gray jacket, and the expression of a woman who had spent 20 years finding things people hoped she would not find. Walter Collins was already standing at the fence. Of course he was. His arms were folded, his mouth was set, his camera hung from one hand like evidence. A few neighbors lingered near the road, pretending not to watch too closely. One man leaned against his pickup. Two women stood near the mailbox. Travis, the boy from Emily's school, rode past on his bicycle, then slowed until he nearly tipped over. A second truck pulled in behind the county vehicle. Emily recognized the Blue Ridge Timber logo immediately. A tall man with silver hair climbed out and looked across the yard. Frank frowned. "Tom Reeves," he murmured. Emily looked at him. "Who?" "New operations manager at the mill." "Why is he here?" "Probably because their wood is in our yard." Tom Reeves shook Frank's hand near the driveway. "Frank, Tom, I wish this was under better circumstances." "So do I." Tom glanced toward the piles behind the barn. They had cleaned everything they could, but the yard still looked rough. Organized, yes. Safe enough, maybe. Pretty, absolutely not. Walter Collins lifted his camera and took another picture. Marion noticed. "Mr. Collins, I'll be conducting the inspection." "I'm only documenting. I have a clipboard for that." Someone near the road coughed to hide a laugh. Walter lowered the camera. Marion walked the property first. She measured the distance between the wood and the fence. She checked for dry bark piled too close to grass. She asked whether any lumber had been treated, painted, or chemically coated. Frank answered every question honestly. Emily stood beside the barn with her hands inside her coat pockets. Tom Reeves stopped near one pile of walnut offcuts. "This all came from us?" "Most of it," Frank said. Tom rubbed his jaw. "We should have handled it differently." Walter snorted. "You think?" Emily looked at him, but said nothing. Marion continued writing. After nearly 30 minutes, she closed one section of her notes and turned toward the barn. "What's inside?" The air changed. It was such a simple question. But to Emily, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Frank looked at her. She looked at the doors. For 3 years, those doors had protected the only place where grief made sense. Inside, no one laughed unless she wanted them to. Inside, broken things could become beautiful if she was patient enough. Inside, her mother was not gone completely. Now the whole town seemed to be waiting outside. Frank stepped closer. "You don't have to do this alone." Emily looked at his hand, the same hand that had welded the frame, sharpened her tools, held the ladder. "Sign late mortgage checks with fingers that sometimes trembled from exhaustion." She nodded. "Then open it with me." Together, they took hold of the iron handles. The old barn doors groaned as they pulled them apart. At first, there was only darkness, a deep, cool darkness carrying the smell of cedar, oil, ash, and old hay. Then Frank reached in and flipped a switch. One bulb flickered, then another, then another. Warm light spread through the barn like dawn climbing a hillside. It touched the floor first, where the roots of the tree of life stretched across the boards in great wooden hands. They curled around stones, disappeared into shadow, rose again as if still searching for earth. Some were pale oak, some were darkened with ash, some carried scars that looked old enough to belong to a real forest. The light climbed higher, up the trunk. Layer by layer, the tree revealed itself. Oak formed the strength of it. Maple flashed in pale scars, where lightning seemed to have split the bark. Walnut darkened the hollows like memory. Cherry ran through it in warm red veins. Cedar peeled outward in thin curls that made the bark look weathered by decades of mountain wind. The trunk was not smooth. It was scarred, twisted, alive. Higher still, the branches spread toward the rafters, hundreds of them, some thick as arms, others thin as fingers. Thousands of hand-carved leaves covered them, no two exactly alike. Some curled at the edges, some carried tiny bite marks, some looked young, some looked ready to fall. Hidden among them were things people noticed slowly. A fox tucked beneath the roots, one paw lifted. A rabbit pressed into shadow. A deer bending toward a carved stream. A tiny church settled between two branches. an owl watching from the hollow of a walnut knot, its eyes made from two dark burns in the grain. A teacher reading to children, a mechanic bent over a broken wheel, a nurse holding a lantern, a mother braiding her daughter's hair, and near the highest branch, two cardinals rested side by side, their wooden feathers so fine that even the still air seemed too heavy for them. Then sunlight found the mirror fragments. Tiny pieces of an old broken mirror, mounted high where no hand could reach them, caught the morning beams coming through the cracks in the barn wall. Light scattered everywhere, gold across the roots, silver along the trunk, blue-white sparks drifting over the leaves. The whole tree seemed to breathe. For nearly half a minute, nobody moved. The county inspector lowered her clipboard. Tom Reeves removed his cap. One of the women by the door covered her mouth. Even Travis, still standing with one foot on his bicycle pedal outside, whispered, "Whoa." Walter Collins stood just past the doorway. His camera hung useless at his side. Frank looked at Emily, but Emily was not looking at the crowd. She was looking at the tree, as if seeing it for the first time through other people's silence. Marion Briggs finally stepped forward. "Miss Carter," she said quietly, "you made this?" Emily nodded. "All of it?" "Most of it." Frank cleared his throat. "She designed it, carved it, joined it, finished it. I helped with the frame." Tom Reeves walked slowly toward the trunk and stopped near a long dark scar. "I know this piece." Emily looked at him. He touched the walnut gently. "Threw it out 2 years ago, split down the middle. I remember thinking it wasn't good for anything." Emily stepped beside him. "I used the split for the lightning mark." Tom leaned closer. The crack he had once seen as failure had become one of the most striking lines on the entire trunk. He exhaled. "Well," he said, almost to himself, "that's a lesson." Marion began walking around the tree, slowly now, not like an inspector, but like someone inside a museum. She found the nurse, the teacher, the mechanic, the child reaching for a leaf. "These are people?" Emily nodded. "People from around here." "Real people? Some. Some are memories of people." Walter had not moved. Then his eyes landed on the low branch near the left side of the trunk. Emily saw the moment he recognized it. An old man kneeling beside rose bushes, a watering can in one hand, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his face younger, softer, turned toward flowers instead of complaints. Walter stepped closer, his mouth opened, then closed. Emily waited. He pointed at the carving without touching it. "Is that supposed to be me?" Her voice was gentle. "It is you. I never looked like that." Frank looked down. Emily did not. "Yes, you did," she said. "When Mrs. Collins was alive." A few people near the door looked at Walter. He swallowed. His face hardened for a second, the way it always did when anyone came too close to the grief he had buried under anger. But the hardness did not hold. Emily continued, "Your roses were the first flowers I remember on this road. Mom used to slow down when we walked by." Walter stared at the carved flowers. "She liked them?" "Yes." His voice dropped. "Lillian planted the yellow ones." "I know." He looked at her. "Your mother told you that?" Emily nodded. Walter looked back at the branch. For the first time in years, he seemed older than angry. "I forgot the yellow ones," he whispered. No one knew what to say. Then Marion Briggs quietly closed her clipboard. "Mr. Carter." Frank turned. She looked around the barn once more. "I still need to inspect the structure. And the outside storage must be corrected. But this," she paused, searching for the right word, "this is not a junkyard." Emily's knees nearly gave out. Frank put one hand lightly on her shoulder. Marion looked at the beams overhead. "The barn can't open to visitors until it's reviewed for safety. I also need the exterior cleaned and the combustible material properly stacked away from the fence." Frank nodded quickly. "We can do that. You'll have 7 days." 7 days? April 22nd. I'll return then. Emily looked toward the tree. And if it passes? Marian's eyes moved over the branches, the roots, the hidden carvings, the scattering light. If it passes, she said, I'll recommend that the county treat this as a preserved art structure, not a code violation. Tom Reeves turned to Emily. Blue Ridge will send racks. Frank blinked. What? Tom looked embarrassed. We dumped half this material here. Least we can do is help you store what's still usable and haul off what isn't. Walter Collins, still staring at his carved younger self, said nothing. But as people slowly stepped back out into the daylight, Emily noticed something. He did not take another photograph. That night, long after everyone had gone, Emily returned to the barn alone. The tree of life stood quietly under the bulbs. It no longer felt like a secret. That should have made her happy. Instead, it frightened her. Secrets were easier to protect. Once the world saw something, it could want things from it. Judge it, buy it, break it, take it away. She sat in the old chair near the workbench and pulled off her gloves. Her hands were shaking. Near midnight, she woke to a sound at the door. A soft scrape, then silence. Emily sat up. Dad? No answer. She reached for the flashlight and swept the beam across the floor. At the base of the tree sat a small wooden box. No ribbon, no name, no note on top. Emily stood slowly and opened it. Inside lay a pair of new leather work gloves. Good ones, with thick palms, careful stitching, and soft lining. Beneath them was a folded piece of yellowed paper. She opened it. It was a pencil drawing of a rose garden. In the lower corner, written in careful hand, were the words, Lillian's Garden, 1978. Signed beneath it, W. Collins. Emily looked from the drawing to the carved branch, where the old man held the watering can. For a long time, she sat beneath the tree of life, with the gloves in her lap. Then she whispered, Thank you. Across the road, in a dark house with no roses blooming outside, Walter Collins sat awake at his kitchen table. For the first time in years, he had opened the drawer where he kept Lillian's things, and for the first time in years, he had not closed it right away. The next morning, 7 days no longer sounded like mercy. It sounded like a dare. Frank was already outside before sunrise, pulling warped boards away from the fence and sorting them into 3 piles. Keep, burn, haul away. Emily came out with the new gloves on. Frank noticed immediately. He nodded toward her hands. Those aren't yours. Emily flexed her fingers inside the leather. They are now. Collins? She looked across the road. His curtains were closed. I think so. Frank lifted a cracked board and tossed it into the burn pile. Man has a strange way of apologizing. Maybe that's the only way he remembers. Frank looked at her for a moment, then went back to work. By 8 o'clock, Tom Reeves arrived with 2 men from Blue Ridge Timber and a flatbed stacked with metal storage racks. He climbed out of the cab, holding a clipboard. Emily smiled faintly. Everyone has a clipboard now. Tom glanced at Marion Briggs, who had just pulled in behind him. I'm new at looking official. Marion stepped out of her county vehicle. I'm not here for the reinspection yet. I'm here because if I wait 7 days and everything is still wrong, I have to write it up. If I show you what needs fixing now, maybe I don't. Frank blinked. That allowed? Marion adjusted her glasses. It's allowed to use common sense before paperwork. For the first time, Emily liked her. By noon, Riverbend Road looked less like the site of a violation and more like a neighborhood workday. Blue Ridge workers assembled racks beneath a temporary cover. Frank cut old lumber into manageable lengths. Emily labeled the usable wood. Tom hauled rotten pieces to the flatbed. Marion pointed out what needed more spacing, what needed to be off the ground, what had to be moved away from dry grass. Then, just after lunch, Walter Collins appeared at the edge of the driveway. No camera, no folded arms. He carried a rake. Everyone saw him. Nobody said anything. Walter walked to the largest pile of bark and began dragging it away from the fence line. Tom looked at Emily. Emily shook her head slightly. Do not ruin it. So nobody did. They worked until the sun dropped behind the trees. Walter left without saying goodbye, but the next morning he came back, and the morning after that. On the fourth day, he brought pruning shears and cut back the thorny brush growing near the Carter fence. On the fifth, he arrived with a thermos of coffee and silently handed it to Frank before picking up his rake. Frank looked at the thermos, then at Walter. You poisoned this? Walter did not smile. Not enough to slow you down. Frank laughed first, then Tom. Then, reluctantly, Walter's mouth twitched. It was not peace, not yet. But it was the first crack in a wall that had stood too long. By April 22nd, the Carter property had changed. The woodpile no longer leaned like an accusation. It stood in rows beneath covered racks, sorted by species and size. Dry bark had been cleared. A firebreak stretched clean between the storage area and the fence. Rotten wood had been hauled away. The old barn still looked worn and red and stubborn, but the hinges worked, the floor had been swept, and temporary braces Frank installed beneath the loft gave the structure a steadier look. Emily stood in front of it that morning, with both hands in her pockets. Frank stood beside her. You okay? No. Want to lie? Not really. Good. I'm tired of guessing. She looked at him. He smiled gently. The sound of tires on gravel turned them both toward the road. Marion came first, then Tom, then the reporter from Asheville, a woman named Claire Hensley, who had heard from someone at the county office that an extraordinary sculpture had been found inside an old barn on Riverbend Road. Emily's stomach tightened when she saw the camera hanging from Claire's shoulder. Frank noticed. You can tell her no. What if no costs us? Then I'll say it for you and make it sound expensive. Emily almost laughed. Marion inspected the yard carefully. She measured the firebreak, checked the racks, looked under the tarps, tested one of the stacks with her hand. Frank answered questions. Tom explained what Blue Ridge had removed and what they planned to pick up monthly. Walter, standing near the barn, said nothing unless asked. Finally, Marion closed her clipboard. The exterior storage is acceptable. Frank let out a breath. Emily closed her eyes. But, Marion continued, the barn still needs a structural review before public access. Tom nodded. I can arrange that through our contractor. Marion looked at him. Soon? Today, if he answers his phone. Claire raised her camera slightly. May I see the sculpture? Emily looked at Frank, then at Marion. Marion said, carefully, no touching, no crowding. Frank opened one barn door. Emily opened the other. For the second time, the tree of life faced the world. Claire stepped in and stopped exactly where the others had stopped a week earlier. Oh, she whispered. The little word said more than a page of praise. She lifted the camera slowly. May I? Emily nodded. Claire took one photograph, then another. Tom walked beside her, pointing out how the reclaimed pieces had been used. Marion examined the lower supports. Walter lingered near the carved roses but did not step close. Emily stood near the trunk, trying to breathe normally. It was almost over. That was when Tom backed up to make room for Claire's shot. His elbow struck a low cedar branch. A sharp crack split the barn. The branch dropped. Leaves shattered against the floor. One tiny carved scene broke into pieces. Nobody moved. Tom went pale. Oh God, he whispered. Emily, I'm so sorry. Emily stared at the broken branch. For a second, she did not understand what she was seeing. Then her knees bent beneath her. She crouched and picked up one of the shattered leaves. 3 years of work, 3 weeks of fear, 7 days of desperate cleaning. The first reporter, the first chance. And now, in front of everyone, the tree was broken. Her throat tightened until she could barely breathe. I can't, she whispered. Frank knelt beside her. Em, I can't do this anymore. The barn went silent. She pressed the broken leaf between her fingers. I tried so hard. I know. No, Dad. The word came out before she could stop it. Dad. Not Frank. Frank's face changed. Emily did not notice. I tried to make one thing stay together, she said, her voice breaking. Just one thing. Frank looked at the pieces on the floor, then at the tree, then at his daughter. He had spent years trying to fix machines, roofs, bills, grief, silence. But sitting beside Emily with the broken branch between them, he finally understood that some things did not need fixing first. They needed witnessing. So he did not tell her it was fine. He did not tell her it could be worse. He did not tell her to be strong. He simply said, "It hurts because it mattered." Emily cried then, quietly at first, then harder. Walter Collins looked away. Marion wiped at one eye and pretended to check her notes. Tom stood frozen, guilt written across his face. After a while, Frank picked up one broken piece and held it in his palm. "Your mother used to say trees don't grow perfect." Emily wiped her face. "They bend," Frank said. "Storms break them. Lightning scars them. People cut them wrong. But if the roots hold," he placed the broken piece beside her hand, "they keep growing." Emily stared at it. Then, slowly, she picked it up. Walter stepped closer. His voice was rough. "Can it be repaired?" Emily looked at him. For once, there was no judgment in his face, only worry. "I need cedar," she said. 3 feet, maybe 4. Not too dry. Wood glue. Clamps. A sharp chisel." Walter turned toward the door. "Who has cedar?" A neighbor near the driveway raised a hand. "I do." "Go get it." Tom immediately removed his jacket. "I'll help." Marion set down her clipboard. "I can hold the light." Claire lowered her camera. "No pictures?" Emily looked up. Claire added, "Unless you want this part told too." Emily looked at the broken branch, then at Frank, then at the people standing around her. People who had once laughed at the piles. People who had once called it junk. People who were now waiting for instructions. She swallowed. "Tell it," she said. Within 10 minutes, the barn became a workshop. A neighbor brought cedar. Another brought clamps. Tom held the ladder and apologized so many times that Emily finally looked at him and said, "If you say sorry again, I'm giving you the sanding job." He nodded. "Understood." Walter knelt beside her and held the new branch steady. His hands were old, but they did not shake. Frank examined the back of the cedar piece. "That angle won't hold." Emily looked at him. "You sure?" He gave her the look he usually reserved for broken engines. "I know how things fail." She almost smiled. "Then show me how they don't." Frank took the chisel. He cut a shallow notch into the back of the branch, not deep enough to weaken it, just enough to lock it into the trunk. Emily watched his hands carefully. They were not graceful like hers, but they were certain. When he handed the piece back, it fit almost perfectly. Emily blinked. "You're good." Frank shrugged. "I've been measuring things my whole life." His voice softened. "Just never measured anything this important." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she began carving. For hours, they worked. Emily shaped the new bark. Frank held the branch. Walter braced the cedar. Tom passed clamps. Marion held the light. Claire documented quietly from the doorway, never speaking unless spoken to. The repair did not become invisible. Emily chose not to make it so. She carved the break into a storm scar, a place where the tree had been wounded and continued anyway. As evening light moved through the cracked barn walls, the mirror fragments caught it again. Tiny sparks drifted over the repaired branch. Gold, silver, blue. The light crossed Walter's face, then Frank's, then Emily's tired hands. When the branch finally held on its own, nobody applauded. Applause would have felt too small. They simply stood together and looked at it. Walter spoke first. Maybe broken things don't always need hiding. Emily touched the new scar. No, she said. Sometimes they just need a place to belong. Claire lowered her camera. Frank looked at his daughter. The girl he thought grief had taken from him was standing under a wooden tree made from everything the world had rejected, teaching adults how to see brokenness differently. And for the first time in years, Frank felt certain Grace was in that barn with them. Not as a ghost, not as a memory that hurt, but as something rooted. After the repair, Claire asked if Emily would stand beside the tree of life for a photograph. Emily immediately shook her head. No. Claire lowered the camera. That's all right. Emily looked down at her hands. They were stained with ash and cedar dust, and the new leather gloves from Walter were folded on the workbench beside her. It's not that I don't want people to see it, Emily said. Claire waited. I just don't want them to think I built it because I wanted attention. Frank stood quietly near the trunk. Walter looked toward the floor. Tom Reeves wiped his hands on his pants and said, Nobody who saw what happened here today would think that. Emily looked at him. He smiled gently. And if they do, they didn't look long enough. Claire adjusted the strap of her camera. What if I don't photograph you smiling? Emily frowned. What? What if I photograph you exactly as you are? Tired, covered in sawdust, standing beside the branch that broke and got repaired. Claire glanced toward the tree. That seems more honest than a smile. Emily looked at Frank. He nodded once. So she stood beside the repaired branch, one hand resting lightly against the carved storm scar. Frank stood beside her, not too close, but close enough that his shoulder almost touched hers. Claire took one photograph. Only one. The shutter sounded small in the barn, but 2 days later, that photograph would change everything. The article appeared on a Sunday morning. Frank found 3 copies of the Asheville paper waiting on the porch before he even made coffee. One had been delivered by the paper route, one had been left by Dale, the truck driver from Blue Ridge Timber, and the third had no name on it, only a yellow rose placed on top. Frank stood looking at the rose for a long moment before picking up the paper. The headline was simple. Local teen turns discarded timber into tree of life. The photograph showed Emily standing under the wooden branches, one hand on the repaired scar, her father beside her, both of them looking not proud exactly, but steady. Behind them, sunlight scattered through the mirror pieces and laid small bright marks across the carved leaves. Emily came downstairs in socks and an old sweatshirt. Why are there 3 papers? Frank held one up. You're in the news. Her face went pale. That sounds terrible. It's not. She took the paper carefully. At first, she only looked at the photograph. Then she read the first line. The county came to inspect what neighbors called a junkyard. What they found instead was a work of art, built from the very pieces others had thrown away. Emily sat down slowly. Frank poured coffee into 2 mugs and placed one beside her. She read in silence. The article told the story of the wood, the barn, the complaints, the broken branch, and the people who helped repair it. It mentioned Grace only once, near the end, when Emily explained the meaning of the wooden heart hidden in the trunk. She had not expected Claire to include that, but the sentence was gentle. At the center of the sculpture is a small carved heart bearing the name Grace, a tribute to Carter's late mother, who taught her that every tree had a story. Emily pressed her fingers over the words. Frank looked away to give her privacy. A knock came at the door. Frank opened it to find Walter Collins standing on the porch. He wore his Sunday jacket. In one hand he held another yellow rose, in the other he held a folded newspaper. Emily stood behind Frank. Walter cleared his throat. I read it. Frank leaned against the doorframe. And? Walter looked at Emily. They spelled Lillian's name right. Emily blinked. She's in the article? Walter nodded and unfolded the paper. Claire had included a short paragraph about the carved gardener on the low branch, and the rose garden that once bloomed across Riverbend Road. Walter folded the paper again. My wife would have liked being remembered for flowers. Emily stepped forward. She should be. For a few seconds, Walter seemed unsure what to do with that kindness. Then he held out the rose, from the last bush that still blooms. Emily took it carefully. Thank you. Walter nodded once, then looked at Frank. Your fence line still needs clearing near the ditch. Frank raised an eyebrow. Walter's mouth twitched. I'll bring tools after lunch. Then he walked back across the road. Emily watched him go. Frank closed the door. That man apologizes like he's afraid the words are taxable. Emily smiled down at the rose. But he does apologize. By Monday afternoon, phone calls began. The first was from the art teacher at Emily's school, then a church group from Asheville, then a small Appalachian Heritage Center, then a retired woodcarver who wanted to know if Emily had ever considered apprenticing. Every call made Emily more uneasy. Frank handled most of them. She's not ready for interviews, he said more than once. No, you can't just stop by. Yes, the barn is private property. No, the tree is not for sale. But that last answer became harder when Tom Reeves returned on Tuesday evening. He arrived after work, still wearing his Blue Ridge timber jacket, and carried a folder under one arm. Frank met him on the porch. If this is about reporters, the answer is no. It's not. If it's about buying the tree, the answer is also no. Tom paused. The owner did ask. Frank's face hardened. It isn't for sale. I figured. Emily had been standing behind the screen door. She stepped out. How much? Frank turned. Emily, I'm not saying yes. I just want to know. Tom hesitated. Then he named a number. It was more money than Frank had ever seen written on any check that did not involve a house. Emily swallowed. For a moment nobody spoke. Frank looked at her. They both thought about the bank letter, the June deadline, the unpaid balance, the roof, the house. Tom saw it all pass between them. I told him I didn't think you'd sell, he said, so I brought something else. He opened the folder and handed Frank a printed proposal. Blue Ridge Timber wanted to sponsor the preservation of the Tree of Life as a reclaimed wood art project. The sculpture would remain on the Carter property. The company would pay for structural upgrades to the barn, safer storage racks, exterior cleanup, insurance coverage for scheduled visits, and a licensing fee for the use of photographs in a campaign about reclaiming discarded materials. Frank read the first page, then the second. Then he reached the amount. His hand went still. Emily noticed. Dad? He did not correct her. Not this time. Tom spoke carefully. It's not charity. We threw that wood away because we didn't know what to do with it. Emily found value in it. That story matters to us. Frank looked at the proposal again. This would bring the mortgage current. Emily looked at him sharply. All of it? Frank nodded slowly. And keep it current for a while. Emily put one hand against the porch railing. Tom looked at her. The tree stays here. You control visits. Nothing happens without your approval. Emily turned toward the barn. Through the open doors she could see the Tree of Life standing in the fading light. For 3 years she had been afraid people would take it from her. Now the only way to save everything might be to let people come close. She looked back at Tom. No one touches it. Agreed. No tours without us. Agreed. No pretending the company made it happen. Tom nodded. Absolutely. And you don't call the wood waste in the campaign. Tom frowned thoughtfully. What do we call it? Emily looked toward the barn again. Unseen material. Frank smiled. Tom wrote it down. Unseen material. 3 weeks later, the barn changed. Carpenters from Blue Ridge Timber reinforced the doors and added hidden supports where Marion Briggs required them. Electricians replaced the dangerous old wiring. Proper lights were mounted high in the rafters, warm enough to show the wood without making the barn feel like a showroom. Frank watched every worker like a hawk. Emily did too. Walter came over most mornings with coffee and criticism. That brace is crooked. The contractor looked offended. It's level. Walter squinted. Level can still look crooked, Frank muttered. Welcome to Riverbend Road. But the work got done. The yard became clean. The racks were covered. The fire break stayed clear. The barn passed inspection. And one Saturday morning in early June, Emily opened the doors for the first official visit. Only 12 people came. 2 teachers, 4 students, a retired carpenter, a church secretary, Tom Reeves, Marion Bricks, off duty this time, Walter Collins, and a little boy who had seen the newspaper photograph and insisted to his mother that there was a fox hidden in the roots. Emily stood beside the trunk, while the visitors stepped inside. Her voice shook at first. "This is oak," she said, touching one root. "It came from a storm-damaged tree." The little boy crouched. "Where's the fox?" Emily smiled. "You have to look like it doesn't want to be found." The boy searched under 3 roots before gasping. "There!" His excitement loosened something in the room. People began looking more carefully. They found the owl, the nurse, the teacher, the mechanic, the deer, the church, the repaired branch. Walter stood near the low branch, where his younger self knelt beside roses. Marion noticed him staring. "You all right, Mr. Collins?" He cleared his throat. "I'm fine." "You sure?" "No," she smiled. "Better answer." At the end of the visit, Emily showed them the repaired branch. She pointed to the 7 open hands carved along the storm scar. "One is for the neighbor who brought cedar. One is for the person who brought glue. One is for Mr. Reeves. One is for Mrs. Briggs. One is for my father. One is for Mr. Collins." The little boy pointed. "What about that small one?" Emily looked at the tiny hand half hidden behind the leaves. "That one is mine." "What's it reaching for?" Emily gently moved a carved leaf aside and revealed the small wooden heart. "For Grace," she said. "My mother." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then the boy whispered, "Did she help you build it?" Emily looked at the tree, then at Frank, then at the light moving across the leaves. "Yes," she said softly, "she did." Years passed, and the name Carter Junkyard did not disappear. It changed. People said it with a smile now. They said it the way towns say things when they are ashamed they did not understand them sooner. The place became a small stop for school groups, woodworkers, church ladies, grieving families, curious travelers, and people who needed to believe something discarded could still become beautiful. Emily did not become famous overnight. She did not move away to become someone else. She stayed long enough to learn that being seen did not always mean being taken apart. Frank kept working at Blue Ridge Timber for a few more years, though he spent more evenings in the barn than in front of the television. Sometimes he helped Emily with frames, braces, and repairs. Sometimes he just sat in the corner with coffee and watched visitors discover the hidden carvings. Walter replanted his rose garden the following spring. Emily helped him. He complained the whole time. "You're planting them too close. You told me to plant them there." "I was wrong," Emily laughed. Walter looked startled, then smiled before he could stop himself. When the first yellow rose bloomed, he cut it carefully and carried it across the road. He placed it just outside the barn doors, beneath the branch where his carved younger self still knelt with a watering can. Then he removed his hat and stood there for a long time. He did not speak to Emily that day. He did not need to. The tree of life remained inside the old Carter barn, its roots gripping the floor, its branches reaching toward the rafters, its carved leaves catching the morning light. It still carried scars, the walnut lightning mark, the ash-darkened grooves, the repaired cedar branch, the hidden heart, and that was what people remembered most. Not that a teenage girl had made something perfect, but that she had made something broken belong. Years later, when visitors asked Emily what the tree meant, she no longer gave a long answer. She simply placed her hand on the trunk and said, "People called this wood junk because they only saw what had happened to it." Then she would look up at the branches. I tried to see what could still grow from it. And inside the old barn on Riverbend Road, beneath thousands of carved leaves and tiny mirrors that turned morning light into stars, the wood everyone else threw away kept telling its story. The story of a mother named Grace, a father who learned to step inside, a neighbor who remembered how to tend roses, a girl who stopped hiding, and a town that finally understood the difference between junk and something waiting for the right hands.